Welcome to a special Monday nightcap, our State of the Union preview. There is now less than 24 hours before President Biden's big speech at 9 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. This will be his first State of the Union before a divided Congress, one with a Republican House majority. It comes 2 years into Biden's first term. Late today, the president hinted at what he'll be telling the nation tomorrow night.
I want to talk to the American people and let them know the state of affairs, what's going on, what I'm looking forward to working on from this point on, what we've done, and just have a conversation with the American people.
With that, let's get smarter with the help of the insiders. Former White House press secretary and MSNBC host Jen Psaki, Simone Sanders Townsend, former chief spokesperson for Vice President Harris and host of Simone on MSNBC and Peacock, and Michael Steele, the only person at the table without a show here. You might want to talk to the executives, former chairman of the Republican National Committee and former lieutenant governor of Maryland. And I'm not even going to let you go first. Jen, you were part of this administration. Tomorrow night comes at a pivotal moment in President Biden's presidency. What does he need to tell the American people?
Well, I think what people are going to get tomorrow night is big, progressive, bold Joe Biden. I mean, they know that
What does that mean?
That means they know one of their biggest challenges right now is that he's done a lot of stuff, accomplished a lot of stuff, and nobody really knows about all those things. And they can't make the speech about that. They know that. You can't do a listicle of all the things you've done. People will tune out. They don't want to know about data. But what he needs to do tomorrow night is tell the story of what he's done and where he wants to go moving forward. And a lot of that, Stephanie, is about how he's going to unify the country, how he's going to keep fighting for the American people, and why people should let him have another 4 years. Without saying that, because it's not a political speech, but there'll be hints of that.
But that's the thing. Polling shows that 62% of Americans don't think he's accomplished much. Right off the top of my head, I could say COVID is largely behind us. That infrastructure law is now placing projects, jobs, real money across 50 states. And don't talk about the economy, which is clearly in recovery. Jobs number low, inflation low, or excuse me, not low. Inflation is slowing. Why doesn't this translate?
They should have hired you. That's
she
the
wasn't
problem.
available.
She wasn't available. She had a show.
See, Michael's looking again. He's angling for a show.
That's what it was. You just laid it out, Stephanie. That was the year that was. That was the conversation that didn't take place. I mean, you're sitting here, 62% of the American people don't think you've done a good job, and they don't trust you on the economy. They don't think you've done anything on the economy. That's a problem for this president going into tomorrow night. I mean, at the end, I agree with him. He can't do the litany of, well, this is what I did. He's got to contextualize what he did with what he's going to do over the next year, going into a presidential cycle. And in the context of that, let people know, A, I'm on your side. B, the team that's booing and sitting on their hands right now, they're not. C, the economy and all those other things that you're concerned about, I'm concerned about them too. Connect to people at a real level so they understand that he's walking with them. That's the Joe Biden that I think a lot of people were kind of expecting to show up. But the White House political shop just blew the pooch on that one and just never really got the kind of traction that would lead him going 18 months into a re-election with the wind in his sails. There's wind, but it's all over the place, and the polls are showing that.
Well, they shouldn't hire me because I misspoke. Jobs are really strong and unemployment is low. So definitely I don't even get the facts straight.
You know, look, with the State of the Union speech, you're not going to change all the hearts and minds, right? And so the president can go up there and talk about all the things that he's gotten done. He can talk about his vision for the future. But the work, I think, comes after. I think we should view the State of the Union speech as the beginning, not of a re-elect, because there's going to be another speech for that, I do believe, but as the beginning of this extremely forceful case that this administration is going to make about what they've gotten done. The day after the State of the Union, cabinet officials will be fanning out across the country. I would love to believe that everyone cares about what's happening in our government so that they're sitting at home tomorrow night watching the State of the Union, and then they're going to tune in to MSNBC. And I think there'll be a lot of people that tune in to MSNBC, but maybe not as many people that will watch the State of the Union. But what they are doing is they're watching their local news. They are they're reading the papers about what's happening in their states and their cities and their towns. And that is why this travel is so important. The president himself is traveling this week. So is the vice president, again, cabinet secretaries. So this is the beginning, not the end. But I also note we need to hear something about police reform.
Doesn't he need to be careful, though, what he promises? Because he's now speaking before a divided Congress. Is there anything that he can say to the American people that Republicans could actually get on board for?
Well, I think the big opportunity, I should say, just to go to Michael's point, is there hasn't been enough contrast that they've been drawing, right? The president is the person who should be drawing that contrast, and then people should follow after him with why his options are better than the other side, right? Compare me to the almighty, not the compare me to the alternative, not the almighty. You'll hear that. But I think tomorrow night, it's not about proposing huge, big initiatives because they've already passed a lot of those. It's about continuing the work that hasn't been finished and let the people sitting in that room sitting on their hands when he's saying we need to do police reform, we need to make sure women have access to an abortion, sit on their hands and not clap. I mean, that is a visual for the public to see. And by the way, there are other things that are not as sexy as that, but people care a lot about, like Social Security, Medicare, protecting those. Those are opportunities to show a bunch of people sitting on their hands when he's saying you should protect
Junk
these things.
fees. I mean, it seems silly, if you will, but when junk fees, and so it's something that we've been told that the president is going to mention in his speech, these junk fees, hidden fees that are tacked on for the American people, whether it's airlines, whether it's when you want to call and cancel your phone service. I was canceling a line this morning.
Or even limit credit card fees.
Limit credit card fees.
Kitchen table issues.
These are things that people care about. And I will say, I saw some posts on social media where oftentimes what the president posts does not make it to the shade room or baller alert or things like that. But the junk fees made it there. And it made it into my non-political group chats, which I think that is a thing that cuts across age, cuts across party lines. It's something everyone is dealing with. And that is something I think that, you know, Republicans might want to get on board with to get
Sitting right behind the president tomorrow will be Kevin McCarthy. Between the two of them is the elephant in the room that's the debt ceiling. How does he approach it?
I think if I'm the president, I approach it head on. In fact, I may turn back and say, you with me, Kevin? I mean, right? Are we on the same page here? Because the folks out here need us to get this done. I think the more he makes this a blue-collar moment, put it in the context that Republicans are trying to move into that space. They want to now become the worker party and all of that. All right, you want to do it? Let's have that conversation. Because if you don't come to the table on this issue, those very same workers may not have a job tomorrow. Those very same workers are going to see higher interest rates, may not be able to buy that first home. All those things that come from the intransigence of a Republican Party that wants to own the libs at all expenses, including at the expense of the American voter, that's how he should frame it. I wouldn't hold back on that. I'd lead right into it and say, okay, y'all want to sit here on your hands and boo? Boo this. And then go out into the country and explain why it doesn't work.
Michael Steele.
He has time.
He doesn't have a show.
He's available if the White House is listening. I mean, I was going to say what Michael said about the
He just turned that frown upside down.
Here you
didn't
go.
he, there?
I will know he gets hopes for me often, and he's
ready
very
to
good.
go.
You know, what Michael said was a really important point. Again, why you should be hired is that it's about who you're speaking to.
Exactly.
And one of the White House officials I was talking to described his approach as speaking to the people who don't feel seen, the invisible Americans, right? The people who feel like nobody's listening to them. They don't get a leg up for work. They don't get a leg up. They're not getting the health care they need. That's who he is speaking to. I'll also say on Kevin McCarthy, you know, Joe Biden, anyone who knows him, we all know him. He's not a person who goes around and punches everybody in the face when he's in a room with them. I don't think he's going to do that tomorrow night, but he is going to pick his moments. And the debt limit is a good moment to do that because it's so irrational to oppose it that I would expect that's one of the moments where he's pretty firm with the people in the room and in his speech.
I think so. The American people need to understand the piece about the debt limit. It is not just fiddling with the full faith and credit of the United States government. The Third Way has a study out that noted if we default, if the debt limit is not raised, Americans stand to lose $20,000 of their savings. Yeah. This is how it really affects you. And I think people need to know that because it's not like the government going to shut down. That does not happen.
When people just hear the U.S. might default, very few people even know what that means. You have to actually say, come June, July, August, here's what's going to happen to you.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And then the key thing about what both of you just said in terms of the people, those self-same people are the folks that, guess who? Donald Trump talks to.
Yeah.
Those workers, those blue-collar, everyday Janes and Joes out there are the very same people that Donald Trump has been appealing to, which is why Trump is taking a position, well, we're not going after Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. No. Why? Because he knows the impact it has on workers. So that angle about the $20,000 is a good jump-off point to have that conversation.
But what's really interesting, when former President Trump spoke, whether it was at a rally or the State of the Union, there was no difference. Every speech was political, and it's we're good and they're bad. Is there a way for Joe Biden to thread the needle and speak to all Americans while reminding them they ain't doing nothing for you?
Yes. I mean, the end of the speech last year, which I just recently reread, was all about...
You're a nerd.
I am a nerd. Proud.
Okay.
Boop, boop. Yeah. Was all about a bipartisan policy proposals that we should be able to work together on. Because, of course, everybody should want to address mental health and opioids and hold tech companies accountable. Now, I think there's a lot of things he could talk about, and I expect he will talk about, where he's basically saying, look, all rational people think we should work together to address these things, and that's what we should do. That is speaking past the divisions in the room, the people who are going to sit up or heckle, and somebody's going to heckle, or many people will heckle, and that's speaking to the 35, 40 million, whatever it is, people who are watching at home and say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. I wasn't sure I liked you, but that sounds pretty good.
I know you don't want to talk about this, or I know you're going to have a feisty response. New York Times has a piece out about how Vice President Kamala Harris has not done enough to define her vice presidency.
According to some people background. Look, I think that this. So first of all, I don't like the people that are attacking the New York Times journalist that wrote the story, because the reality is they went to write the story because they want to cover her. But in my experience, having been the person who, would have been the person trying to beat back some of these stories when I worked for the vice president, there are journalists that set out to do decent, good stories on her. There are also people that have terrible, biased, sexist, racist angles, and we need to talk about that as well. But when the people that are setting out to do good stories, when they go to people who claim to be allies, but they're really just, allies in sheep's clothing, if you will, not actual allies, people that always have a criticism. I don't know my allies that always have criticism. Then that's where the stories turn. So I think it's this. The vice president is a historic entity. She's a historic person who has all these expectations from outside individuals, expectations that do not match up with the reality of the vice presidency. She is doing real work, whether we're talking about the root causes of migration. Today, she just had another event on that where she laid out commitments from corporations, whether it is the work that she did to rally folks around the issue of abortion. Talk to the activists and the advocates. They will tell you that it was the work of the vice president during this summer through up until the midterm elections that let them know their work was important and why they continued to press forward. And so I don't know, the critics, I'm just like, if you don't know, if political professionals do not know what the vice president is doing, it is because they have chosen not to follow her work closely, which I think they should just be honest about that. If regular, everyday American people don't know, then it is on the work of her staff to ensure that they are going the extra mile, travel, interviews, podcasts, all the things. And I do think they are trying to do that. But these allies want to be critical.
Everyday American people ever know what a vice president's doing, though?
Sure they do.
That.
Sure they do. Sure they do.
No, when's the last vice president they knew what they did? They didn't know what Joe Biden did. Dick Cheney was the last vice president they knew somebody did something.
People understood Joe Biden's role in the Obama White House.
How about Dan Quayle? What were his great achievements?
But again, that's my point. Each vice president has a different relationship with his or her president. And the president, speaking as someone who's a former number two, all right, is very little difference in terms of the role, because if you're running as a team, the president, the governor, those individuals are the ones who are setting the agenda. Your job is to carry that water. You may have your own stuff as well that you do. But I think in this case, the thing that's the most important is what you put your finger on at the end there, how the staff best serves her publicly. Because what happens is, if the public's on board with the vice president, it don't matter what a reporter who's got an agenda writes, because the public is going to come back and defend against that, as well as the White House or anybody else. Absent that, these stories tend to populate the ether in a way that takes down her confidence. I mean, like the whole thing with the border, the whole thing about what's her role, and then you get the nitpicking among Democrats who are like, well, no, she can't be, she's not my first choice if Biden doesn't win. Of course she's the first choice, because who else is going to be the first choice after the president? So those are some of the challenges that she's had. She's weathered them for the most part. But I think over the next few months, to your point, it's an opportunity for her to sort of break out that shell a little bit. And I think Joe Biden wants her to do that, and will let her do it.
I really want to press this point because everyone keeps saying this. What do y'all want the lady to do? Because she is doing it. And I am not speaking as I'm not just as a person who has worked for her.
Nobody knows what she's doing.
Then I would argue that the people are not paying attention. She held an event today about the root causes of migration where she laid out commitments from businesses in the region. Multiple outlets wrote about it, and people are still saying they don't know.
I know what she's doing.
Simone is going to educate you during the commercial break,
That's right.
and then you're going to head back to Maryland tomorrow and tell everybody you know.